Well, it's really nice to be here. I thought a lot about what I wanted to talk about, and I've been a venture capitalist off and on for 15 years. And one of the things that struck me when I thought about what I wanted to cover today is that while the technology infrastructure that many of you are using to build your startups has changed, the advice that we as VCs give you really hasn't. It really hasn't kept up with what some of these technological changes have enabled. So I wanted to give you one person's perspective on new ways to think about startups if you're getting started today. So when I think about when I started my venture career in the late 90s, there was a really simple playbook for how you built a company if you were ambitious. You went and bought a bunch of hardware and found a colo space and set everything up yourself. It was really expensive. Thanks to our hosts at Amazon, none of you need to do that anymore, so we should give them a round of applause for making that part of the process much easier. But the thing I really want to touch on today is when I got started in venture in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was this real ethos that everyone needed to be in the same room, in the same place, in order to build a highly successful startup. And over the last 10 or 15 years, having done a few startups myself, having advised and invested in over 100 companies, I no longer believe that all the things that we've been telling startups for a long time are true. So I want to run through a handful of things that at least I as an investor am reconsidering when I think about my own investment criteria at Precursor. And a lot of these are things I've learned from working with companies that I've backed and seeing them succeed in ways that maybe previously weren't possible. So that old formula was you rack and stack your own servers, you build a team, it better be in the Bay Area if you were serious, regardless of cost. You build that product and find customers, you go raise venture capital money, then you IPO and succeed, and you start over again. And I really do think that times have changed and the advice hasn't kept up. So let's dive into a couple of things that I think are different. So I think at the fundamental basis for why all this change has happened is that the cost equation for startups has changed. This is probably not news to people in the room, but the thing I'd like to highlight is I think a lot of the cost equation conversation has really been on the technical infrastructure level. It's cheaper to get started, you can turn AWS on and get going from day one, but there are a lot of other elements of the cost equation of running a startup that have also changed that I don't think we've explored as much. And I think on the one hand, operating costs in some of the major metros have gotten a lot more expensive. And as our previous speaker mentioned, Portland is a good safety valve if the prices that San Francisco and New York are getting to you. And I think, but more importantly and probably less well discussed, the cost of collaboration and coordination, which isn't a financial cost, but it's a tax your organization pays. I think that cost has come way down, and it's finally come down enough that I think you can think creatively about where you put people and what you ask them to do. So I think what I'm seeing across my portfolio at Precursor is a true decline in centralized teams. Just to give you some perspective, our first fund, we've invested in 81 companies. 55 of them are based here in the Bay Area. But even the ones who are based here in the Bay Area, many of them have development teams, sales operations, one or two remote folks that are based somewhere else. And in some cases, that's due to cost, and in some cases, that's due to the personal preference of that person. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of what I've seen happening. And I think there was a real logic to the old narrative about why you wanted everyone in one place. It was just way easier to build culture if you have everybody in one office, in one place, in one location. You get water cooler conversation, you get that sort of hallway talk, people can see each other and communicate face to face. It made communication easier. And frankly, who here tried to use video conferencing or even like a good dial-in number in the late 90s, early 2000s? It was expensive and it was a pretty miserable experience. And trying to run a company on that infrastructure probably wasn't worth it. But when I think about what's happening today, we have tons of good tools for teamwork, both within the four walls of your company and with partners, whether that's Slack or Zoom or video conferencing, any video conferencing solution of your choice. I think it's really easy to get online everywhere, and it's kind of funny to think that 10 or 15 years, you couldn't presuppose that you could get good wireless or cellular coverage wherever you went. And last but not least, I think as more teams run these experiments with having people outside of HQ, the knowledge base of how you build and maintain and nurture a culture where everyone's not in the same room is becoming easier. There are more people you could talk to if you wanted to have engineers abroad. And I also think this should be no surprise to those of you who live and work here in San Francisco. I think we're finally reaching the point where the cost of building a company on the coast in San Francisco and New York is becoming a legitimate issue for startups. And remember, I deal with startups that are typically raising $1 million or less for their first round and are very cost conscious and are very focused on capital efficiency. And I think, look, there's some great reasons to be in these super dense hubs like San Francisco or New York. There's tons of talent, lots of engineers, product people and designers who want to live there. But because talent's abundant and the markets are dense, there's a lot of competition. And so while there might be tons of people you could hire, getting them to come work for your specific venture is still a challenge. I think the other thing is that the people you hire, they have to be able to afford to live in the place where you've set up your company. And San Francisco and New York have a really high cost of living and really high cost of operation, and everything from salaries and benefits to office space to the sort of second order effects of what you need to pay people so they can have the lifestyle that they're looking for themselves and their families. And so about a third of the companies we've backed are based outside of the Bay Area. The one thing I will say is, I think that number is going to increase. The one thing that gives me pause, and one thing worth thinking about as a founder, for those of you who are thinking about starting your companies elsewhere, I think it's never been easier to start a company outside the Bay Area. I think there's still a question of how big you can get in some of these non-San Francisco, New York metros. Can you attract capital? Is there enough local talent? Or are you committed to building and growing and becoming an anchor company in your community? I think it's still early to know whether you can still build the same scale of company outside of the Bay Area. And the thing that makes me happy as someone who has companies that are not all based in San Francisco, so I have 3 companies that are based in Toronto, 5 in Southern California, a dozen in New York, 2 in the Carolinas, 1 in Tampa, 1 in Baltimore, 2 in Boston. If I had to get on a plane to visit them all, it would be all that I do. And I'm happy to say that, in my opinion, the collaboration tools that we've been talking about since the beginning of the internet, they actually work now. You can use video conferencing reliably, and it's cheap. You can use it on your phone, you can use it on your laptop, you can use it on your tablet, you can use it anywhere, you can use it on the go. That to me is a huge game changer in terms of face-to-face, high-fidelity conversations. We've got pick your own flavor of group-based chat. Makes it really easy for people in different departments within the same company or with partners to communicate regularly in real time. Huge game changer in terms of keeping communication lines open. And I think it's just a lot easier to push code to the cloud. You don't have to all be sitting in the same room in order to do so. And these things are finally growing up. And I think I personally have been waiting for a decade for these tools to get to the point where they're mature enough that you can actually run your company on them. But I would say the thing I see companies that I'm dealing with wrestle with most is, while now that these things are possible and they can be done, the question is, well, should you do them? Is it the right decision for your startup? And I'm talking to a handful of the portfolio right now who are thinking about what I think is the fundamental divide is, do we want to be a centralized, headquarters-focused company? Do we want to be fully distributed where everybody works wherever they are, kind of a la a buffer, where you've got people everywhere and there is no central HQ? Or do we want a blended model where we have kind of 1 or 2 core offices, but we're willing to incorporate and support people who are not in one of our hub offices but work remotely? And I think the big questions here are, hiring remotely when you don't get to interact with those people face-to-face every day is a different skill, and it's a different process, and it's a different technique than hiring people that live and work in the city where the company's based. And I think retaining people and making them feel a part of your culture and a part of the organization when you don't have that daily in-person interaction is a challenge. It doesn't happen automatically. It requires real effort and work. And I think it puts a different kind of strain on management to make sure that everybody stays in the loop and stays coordinated, because being in a central office is a crutch. You don't have to be as good about documentation, formal communication. You can lean over and chat with people. And building a culture where the people who are not in headquarters or when everyone's not in the same place feel included in the conversations is a real cultural challenge that you have to tackle if you're going to go this way. I think the other piece that's really changed, and the reason I started Precursor, is the way you can fundraise and finance a startup has really changed. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure that all of these changes are actually good for you as entrepreneurs. And I'll tell you why. I think in the old model, it was really simple. There were a couple of really discrete rounds and ways you financed. You got a little bit of money from angels or your friends and family to get started. There was no institutional seed round of $2 to $3 million. If you had a good company, you raised the Series A. You went to Series B, you had a growth round, you went public. The good news was that it was simple. There were only a few steps you could take in the journey, The bad news was if you didn't fully get all of the work done to go from angel funds and family to Series A, there was no safety net for your company. Pretty much died and shut down, or you got a bridge from your existing investors. And I think a lot of the innovation that's happened in startup financing is VCs and other financing sources have emerged to kind of fill in these gaps. Well, you raised some friends and family money, but you're not quite ready for Series A. Well, we'll give you this new thing called the seed round, which is a $2 to $3 million round that will help you develop the metrics that you need to get ready for Series A. Oh, you raised the seed round, you're not quite ready for Series A. We have this thing called the seed extension, which is another round that will help you get closer to Series A. And so the good news for you as founders is there are many, many more sort of off-ramps and waypoints for you to raise money based on the traction and progress you've made with the business. The downside is all of this creates a lot more confusion. The nomenclature of what you call these rounds has changed. When I started in the business, a big seed round was $1 million. That was considered large. Today, a big seed round is $3.5 million. People still call it a seed round. It's 3 times as much capital. And some of the firms that used to write that $500K check into a $1 million round now want to write $1.5 million checks into a $3 million round, and they still call themselves seed firms. So it puts the onus on you as entrepreneurs to understand the changing business models in venture. And now, at last count I saw, there are over 500 early stage venture capital firms. That's a lot of firms for you to know, index, and figure out if they're right for you. In the world where there were fewer firms, it was just a lot easier to figure out who you should approach. And again, I think it's great to have more options, but more options means more time spent fundraising and more choice for you. The other thing that I think people haven't really thought about as much is all of these incremental rounds of fundraising, every time you raise more money, you're selling more of your company. And so for you as founders, it means the good news is you can have this high resolution fundraising where you're raising a little bit of money along the way. But the total cumulative dilution to you, I think, is actually probably worse than it was in the old day. Because now you sell a little bit of your company a lot of times to a lot of different people, whereas in the old days, you sold a big chunk of your company every now and then to 1 or 2 people. I think the other thing is with more fundraising, this high resolution fundraising where you have all these other options, it means you as founders are likely going to spend more of your time fundraising because there are more incremental rounds that you could put together along the way. And who here has gone through the fundraising process to date? Hopefully you would all agree that it's a big distraction from running your company and building the product. And so the more often you have to press pause and fundraise, the more distraction you have within your company. And I also just say every 6 months, the milestones and waypoints for getting that new round done change. And last, you have more options other than just VCs. ICOs, tokens, or cryptocurrency are the new thing. Before we had that, we had pre-order campaigns, Kickstarters, and crowdfunding, mostly for hardware companies. And we've got things like Patreon, and I'd say the rebirth of subscriptions give companies more ways to raise money directly from your own customers. I think the other thing I would say that's really changing the way that I think about having conversations with startups, and something you should all consider, is I think this whole notion of companies staying private longer is the new norm, and I think it's here to stay as long as the private markets are willing to provide large amounts of capital to private venture-backed startups. This has really profound implications for how we think about managing companies, incentivizing employees, and how you as founders and entrepreneurs should think about your own ownership position. I think in a world where companies didn't stay private very long, 5 to 7 years, and you go public, a 4-year option grant with a 1-year cliff and a 3-year vesting schedule kind of made sense because the length of that option was roughly tied to sort of the useful life of that private company. And you weren't going to have a company that was private for 10 years. And now you look at Dropbox, Uber, Pinterest. We have a number of companies within walking distance from here that are probably will be private for a decade before they go public. And it's worth asking, in a world where people could stay that whole time, is the 4-year option structure that we put in place, is it the best for the employee? And is it best for you as founders to offer that? And I'm finally beginning to see some movement and conversation around that. I think the second thing is, for a long time, it was taboo for founders to sell early. It was considered a poor signal for you to sell a portion of your ownership in the company before VCs and other folks had a chance to get out. With companies staying private for a decade, VCs like me and founders should have the opportunity to potentially sell a little bit along the way. And now there's already infrastructure for people who want to sell. This is the new thing. I still have friends who've been in venture their entire career who think this is a bad thing. I think this is just the reality. Now, if companies are going to stay private longer, there's going to be more demand for liquidity from shareholders, both employees and early investors, before there's a major IPO event. And I also think at some point we're gonna learn, does staying private actually pay off? I think the thesis has been, if you stay private longer, you can build more, you can get the product ready, you can sort of get the organization ready for the rigors of being a public company, and when you finally do IPO, you'll be better off. It's unclear. We've had some IPOs this year that have not done great, and in some cases where the current trading price is below the last private market valuation, which is not good for the shareholders of the company, it's not good for the employees. So I think with this next batch of companies, we're gonna learn whether this notion that staying private longer is a good thing is in fact true. So I want to leave you with a few final thoughts and a couple things to consider, because I'm wrestling with these issues and I don't claim to have answers to all of them myself. The good news for you is that I think most of the playbooks around what you do in venture and how you build a good, ambitious company, I think they're pretty stale. And that's a good thing for you, because when the playbooks really work, anyone can apply them and it's easy to do. I think we're in a moment in time where technology is finally unlocking a lot of promises for startups. And I think the companies that really grapple and wrestle with these issues have an advantage. I think it's worth saying that everything I've just told you is not widely held or widely believed by every other VC or pundit out there. Some people will still tell you got to build a company in San Francisco and you got to have everyone under one roof. Do not run these experiments. It will destroy your company. And I think the good news is you're all here because you're trying to do things differently. And I really believe that this changing technology infrastructure, combined with this changing financial landscape, gives you all the opportunity and the license to try to build companies that look and feel different. And the last thing I'll leave you with is most of the benefits are going to go to people who do these experiments early. By the time we resolve decentralized teams, headquarters versus no headquarters, fully remote, by the time there's a consensus, somebody else will have taken advantage of the opportunity to experiment and learn and captured all that benefit. So if you're going to wait for the dust to settle on all these things, that's fine, but I think you're missing out on a big opportunity. And I think I would encourage all of you to run some cool experiments with your own startups around how you structure your teams and how you think about fundraising, because there's never been a better time, I think, to break the mold and think differently. So I want to thank you for giving me a chance to kind of share some things I've been wrestling with as an investor, and thank you very much for the time. I really appreciate it.